Attached, you find the very simple Angular project where I essentially only have 3 links that take me to different pages for 2 different user IDs here and to the home page. Now, of course, there is one thing we already learned about in the routing section, and that can be found in the user component, which you find here in the user folder in that attached project. In the user component TypeScript file, of course, I have already set up a subscription to listen to changing route params so that if I am on the user page, as I'm here, because user 1 and user 2 share the same component, if I'm here and I have the user ID 1 loaded and I click on user 2, this updates here in the DOM, even though it technically is the same component, and that is something you'll learn about in the routing section. Now, this is using an observable. Params here is an observable to which we subscribe. And that's just one thing you can already keep in memory. Observables are constructs to which you subscribe to be informed about changes in data. Because remember, observables are that stream of data, and whenever a new data piece is emitted, our subscription will know about it. So in this case here, params is the observable. It's a stream of route parameters, and that stream gives us a new route parameter whenever we go to a new page, whenever that parameter in the URL changes. And then here in this function we pass to subscribe, we get the new params, and we can extract our relevant param, in this case the ID param, from that. So that's how this built-in observable works and how you can think about it. Params is the observable, it's that stream of data that gives us new values. Now that's all nice, and Angular will heavily use such observables, and there you will never need to create them yourselves. You only subscribe to them, you don't need to create them, but to understand them, it certainly doesn't hurt to also create them. So let's do that as a next step. Let's build our own observable from the ground up and understand its internals. To build our own observable, I'll go into that home component, and there in ng-on-init, I want to build a new observable. Now, observables are a feature that's not baked into JavaScript or TypeScript. Instead, they're added by a package named RxJS. And that's why in Angular projects, if you have a look at package.json, which lists all your dependencies, you find RxJS here. Now, in the home component, I want to build my own observable here in ng-on-init, and for that we can import something from that RxJS package. So let's import from RxJS, and we don't need to do that when using observables, because thanks to TypeScript, it understands that params is an observable, and therefore it knows we can subscribe there, and we never need to explicitly inform it about the type. But if we want to create a new observable, we need certain features from that RxJS package. To be precise, that RxJS package gives us different ways of creating a new observable. And one of the easiest ways is the interval method, the interval function. You can just import interval like this, and then here you can call interval and pass in a number. And that is a bit like setInterval, where you pass a number in milliseconds that will fire an event every X milliseconds. So if I pass 1000 here, then every second a new event will be emitted. Now this gives us an observable, and therefore we can subscribe to the observable here. And there I can now get my count. You can name this whatever you want and handle this or use this inside of this function. So I'm passing an anonymous function here to subscribe. That's the first argument we can pass to subscribe. It's the handler for all the data values that are emitted. So I pass this in, it gets the value that is emitted as an argument, and I just name this argument count because it turns out it will be an incrementing number for interval. We'll later also build an observable entirely from scratch where we fully control the emitted values. Here we'll take this half measure, which is a built-in function that gives us an observable, but still it's more from the ground up than the ones Angular ships with. So here we have interval, which will fire a new value every second. And in this function here, I will simply console log count. So the idea now is that we get a new value emitted every second and we log that to the console. Now let's save all files and open the developer tools here in our browser. And there, let's go to the JavaScript console and navigate to the home page. And there you should now see incrementing values being logged to the console, one value every second. And that, of course, comes from that interval function that gives us an observable. And again, this is not an observable we built entirely from the ground up, but it's pretty close. Now, when I navigate away now to user 1, you see that this keeps on counting. And that is something you have to be aware of. Observables don't necessarily stop emitting values just because you're not interested in them anymore. There are certain observables that emit a value once and they're done, like for example an HTTP request where you get back a response, something you'll see later in the HTTP module of this course. But there are other observables that keep on emitting values. And to stop that, and therefore to prevent memory leaks, which you would otherwise introduce if that keeps on emitting whilst you're not interested in it anymore, you should unsubscribe from any observable in which values you are no longer interested. And that's really important because before we do that, watch what happens if I go back to the home page. I'm on user 1, I was on home before, now I go back to home. What you now see is a new observable started. So we have the old one going on and a new one. And of course, we can repeat that. We get more and more observables counting. And that, of course, is very bad. If that happens behind the scenes, you quickly run out of resources and you slow down your app. You introduce a memory leak here because your memory gets occupied a lot by data you don't need. So you definitely need to clear that. And to do that, we should store our subscriptions. And here I'll then name this first obs subscription. You can name it whatever you want. And the type of this private property of the home component will be subscription. And subscription also needs to be imported from RxJS. So make sure to add this import. And now here, subscribe actually returns such a subscription. So when we subscribe, we can store that subscription in our first ops subscription property. So we're not storing the observable here, that's the observable, but we instantly subscribe here, and therefore we store whatever subscribe returns, and subscribe returns a subscription. Now, the idea behind storing the subscription simply is that we now can also implement onDestroy here, which you need to import from @Angular core, and that forces us to add the ng-onDestroy lifecycle hook, and inside of ng-onDestroy, we can now use our subscription and call unsubscribe. And that means that whenever we leave that component, we clear that subscription. And therefore, we prevent memory leaks because we're not keeping old subscriptions around. Now, if you save that and reload the app, you see our observable starts again. But if I navigate away, we get no new values. If I go back, it starts at 0 again, but the old observable is dead because we unsubscribed. And that's an important step. So this is an important step towards understanding observables. One common question I get is, okay, we unsubscribe here. Why don't we unsubscribe in the user component here, where we also set up a subscription? And that is a valid question. The answer simply is Angular does that for you. For the observables provided by Angular, like params, but also any other observable you'll encounter throughout this course that is provided by an Angular package or by a feature provided by Angular, all these Angular observables are managed by Angular. And therefore, you don't need to unsubscribe manually here. Angular will take care about this. So I promised you a custom observable to understand its internals, and what I gave you was interval. Now, it's closer to a custom observable because it's not coming from some Angular feature, but still this of course is kind of a utility function that gives us a predefined observable that fires a number every second. Well, actually, we can rebuild this manually. Let's comment out this code and let's build a real custom observable now. I'll store that in an observable, in a constant, and I'll name it custom observable or custom interval observable. You can of course pick any name you want. And to create a new observable, we can simply import observable, the type itself, from RxJS. Now you can use observable and call a create method on that. And this will do what it sounds like. It creates a new observable. Now, create actually takes a function, and I'll pass in an anonymous arrow function here, like this, which will get an argument automatically. RxJS will pass in that argument for us. And that argument is a so-called observer. Now, what's an observer? Now, you heard about the observer in the first video of this module. The observer, in the end, is the part that is interested in being informed about new data, about errors, or about the observable being completed. Now, our job here is to tell the observer about new data, about an error, or about the observable being completed. Here, we're not responsible for listening because the observer is the listener. Here, we get that listening part as an argument, and we need to tell it once we're done, once new data is there, and so on. So in this anonymous function, we can now use the regular setInterval method and set an interval of 1 second, let's say, as before. Now this again receives an anonymous function. It's the normal setInterval method, nothing special about that. And inside of setInterval here, we can now call console log or do whatever we want, or simply use our observer. And there, we now got methods like next. We can call next here to emit a new value. And that is important. The observer has a couple of important methods. Next is one of them. Error is another of them. So that would be the one you use to throw an error. And complete is one to let the observer know that you're done. Here, however, we use next. And to also have an incrementing number here, we can simply introduce a variable, count, which starts at 0. Inside of our setInterval, we then simply pass this on to next, and we then increment count by 1. So now here count starts at 0, we increment it by 1 whenever setInterval fires, and we let our observer know about that new data here. Now we can also subscribe to our custom observable. And I'll do this in the same place here in ng-on init. Of course, you could do this in other places too, if this were stored in a service or in a property of that component simply. So here I can now call subscribe. And to subscribe, you pass the same thing as before. A function that simply accepts the data we're emitting. So in this case, we could name it count again, or to avoid naming confusion, simply name it data, whatever you want. And here I will now console log that data, just as before. Now let's save that all, and let's wait for this page to reload. And again, you see the same result as before, but now we built our own interval observable. And this is roughly what's happening under the hood here for the built-in interval observable too. It's giving us an observable, which will essentially fire for every X milliseconds we defined. And it lets our observer know about that new data. And that's what's happening here too. And if I navigate away, well, then we get a problem here because I tried to call unsubscribe of undefined because I don't store my subscription. Of course, that should be done here. So in my first op subscription, I'll now store that subscription again, simply by storing the result of subscribe in the subscription again. So now with that, if that reloads and I navigate away, that works without issues again. If I go back, a new observable starts. So this is working, and this is a real custom observable. And this shows us how to emit new data. But what about errors and completing the observable? I mentioned this as well.